recording. Welcome everyone to the first discussion of the fall 2023 in the series on research and language learning. My name is Olga Makarova. I'm a research specialist with the Slavic Reference Service at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. The Slavic Reference Service, REES, and Language Workshop at Indiana University started this series last year. This year, our partners are also the American Councils and Millikan Center at Arizona State University. And the goal is to invite established scholars and specialists to discuss the role language proficiency plays in their research, as well as their academic careers. The series is a space to converse about language learning, research projects, and ways language skills advance academic achievements. I'm delighted to introduce, even though it feels like no introductions are necessary, our guest today, Mark Trotter, who is the Associate Director and Outreach Coordinator of the Russian and East European Institute at Indiana University. He received his BA from McGill University and MA at the University of Michigan. He taught Russian language, Russian culture, and general linguistics at Grinnell College, University of Michigan, Indiana University, as well as in Hungary. From 2004 to 2007, Mark was resident director and academic coordinator of the newly initiated flagship program in Russian language based at St. Petersburg State University. He sits on the board of directors of the American Council of Teachers of Russian and serves as national co-chair for the Olympiad of Spoken Russian. He has been certified by the American Council on the Teaching of Foreign Languages as an oral proficiency tester for Russian at all levels. And today, Mark is going to talk about the role of Russian language in his life and academic career and profession. So, Mark, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Olga, for the very generous introduction. I'm going to try to do that share screening again, and we'll hope it goes a little better this time. Okay, yes, there we go. Okay, so, oh, okay, that's because it's a screen. Oh yeah, okay, sorry. Okay. Oh, okay, there we go. Great. Let me get everybody up to the side there. So okay, almost ready. Okay, well, thank you very much, Olga, and thank you, Olga, Joe, Wilson, and Kathleen for inviting me to speak in this series. To tell you the truth, I feel a little presumptuous in taking part in a series that has the word research in it. As will become evident throughout this presentation, I am really not much, nor have ever been much of a researcher. However, I consider myself an almost lifelong language learner, first of Russian and subsequently of Hungarian, a pursuit which as regards both languages continues until the present, and will be with me for many, many years to come, I hope. So as you can see, I will be talking about really what Russian and the Russian language has meant for me during the course of, really half a century or so, maybe even longer. So let's start, and we'll go to the next slide. What you see on the right is my alma mater. I'm a graduate of Lower Merion High School. Basketball fans may recognize this as the alma mater of the late Kobe Bryant as well. He was a couple classes behind me. And this was basically where I began the study of Russian as an 11th grader. Now, the funny thing is that there's some family history to this. The fellow that you see on your left is the late Kenneth Trotter, my father, a legendary teacher in the Lower Merion School District. This is in suburban Philadelphia. My father had a great interest in foreign languages too. He was a high school student during the Second World War, and an avid German student at that. He hoped to join the war effort as a spy, actually, to go behind enemy lines and engage in espionage and reconnaissance work. Fortunately, the war ended before he had the chance to do that. But during the course of his college studies, he continued to study German and actually studied a little bit of Russian. No more than 2 years, but it was enough to inspire him to begin an after-school Russian program at the junior high school where he taught for many, many years, Ardmore Junior High School, which was a feeder school into my high school. So in 1957, hard on the heels of the Sputnik launch, my dad started an after-school Russian program, and it was actually so popular, mind you, on the basis of just 2 years of college Russian. His Russian was not all that great, but on the basis of that program and its success, Russian was officially adopted as a regular school subject at my high school. So in a way, I'd like to dedicate this to my dad, legendary teacher, and we'll move on. Now, I should say that it wasn't really my father that inspired me to take Russian. It was actually a television show. When I was in the 10th grade, this would have been back in 1971, I happened upon something called Masterpiece Theater. I don't know, some of you may remember what that was. I don't know if it's still around. But back then, these were basically TV versions of novels, serialized, and I happened in on kind of in the middle of a serialization of Fyodor Dostoevsky's novel, The Possessed, or as it's more frequently translated, The Devils. And I was just utterly taken by what I was seeing. The lives of these characters, so intense, so embroiled in ideas and emotions. For somebody from the suburbs of Philadelphia, it was pretty powerful stuff. So much so that in the summer after 10th grade, I kind of went on a binge read of everything that I could get my hands on that had been translated from Russian into English, so far as 19th century and even a little bit of 20th century literature. And after that summer, I began the study of Russian language proper. But I must say, I was not a very serious student of Russian in high school. It did provide me with the ability to read Cyrillic, and oddly enough, a fairly good basis in pronunciation. My first Russian course, my first semester of Russian actually had no written text in the textbook. It was all pictures. I was learning by the so-called, at that time, revolutionary audiolingual method, which has since fallen into deep disfavor. But like I said, it was enough to give me some good pronunciation-based grammar and vocabulary, not so much. I took up Russian again as a sophomore at McGill University. Here you see McGill in the summer, and then a more characteristic scene from McGill deep in the heart of winter. And it's basically since that time that, my lifelong involvement with Russian continues uninterrupted. Now, I had many different teachers of Russian. Most of them were pretty good. But there are really two that I want to single out in this presentation. And in both cases, they were really not teaching me Russian in any kind of official capacity. But I do believe that I learned more Russian and more about Russian culture from these two unofficial teachers than anybody else. One of those teachers, you see, she's the older woman to the right of the photograph, holding a Chopin manuscript in front of her. This is Larissa Frumkin, along with her daughter, Anya von Bremsen, who you may have heard of. She's made quite a name for herself as a writer of cookbooks. At that time, she was studying to be a professional musician on the piano. I was very fortunate to make Larissa's acquaintance after my first year of university Russian, and that the acquaintance soon blossomed into a very close friendship. We began to speak more and more Russian with each other. And she also introduced me to the Russian-speaking community in Philadelphia. In fact, Larissa was instrumental in helping me to secure employment immediately after received my bachelor's degree in a position where I would use Russian on a fairly regular basis. This was between the years of 1979 and 1981. When I was employed as more or less a social worker for something called the Jewish Employment and Vocational Service in Philadelphia. There you can see kind of their mandate. And much of my work involved assisting those who had immigrated from the Soviet Union as part of the so-called third wave of Russian immigration. The first one being what they sometimes call the white immigration during the revolution, right after the Bolshevik Revolution, during the Civil War. The second wave, those that came over right after World War II, and then finally this third wave, which was primarily a Jewish immigration. Those of you who know Soviet history will understand that Jews in the Soviet Union were discriminated against in various different ways, but through the efforts of Western countries, the United States, I believe in particular, agreements were reached with the Soviet Union whereby a limited number of Soviet citizens of Jewish ethnicity were allowed to emigrate. It wasn't that easy. The conditions under which they emigrated were pretty demanding in a lot of ways. We can go into that more if you like later on. Ostensibly, they were all being repatriated, so to speak, to Israel. but many of them decided not to go to Israel and to go to the United States instead, as you can see from this map. So about one in 8 of those Soviet immigrants, Jewish immigrants, it was primarily Jews. There were a couple of Georgians and Armenians thrown in, but 1 in 8 of them went to the United States of America, and I worked with those that had settled in the Philadelphia area. You can see actually at the right of the screen a newspaper that was specifically created for the third wave immigrants. Actually, one of the main editors you see there, Sergei Devlatov, whom some of you may have read. He's the fellow with the mustache in the middle. Served as the editor for a number of years. This newspaper was actually a rival to another Russian language newspaper published at the time in the United States called the Novaya Ruskaya Slovo, which, despite the name, was rather stodgy and set in its ways. It's basically a newspaper of the first and the second wave. Novaya Amerikanets was in part created as a way to keep in better touch and to reflect more the particular needs and outlooks of those in the third wave. Now, alongside my work at JEVS, where I spoke Russian quite a bit, I didn't work exclusively with Russian speakers. At this time, there was a very large wave of immigrants from Vietnam. I worked from Cambodia and Laos. I worked with some of them as well as with American clients in need of vocational assistance. But probably half my time was spent speaking Russian with Soviet immigrants. And even after hours, most of my social life revolved around the Russian language community. I had a kind of peculiar existence whereby my social life was taking place, by and large, in Russian for those 2 years, 1979 through 1981. Now, backtracking a little bit, as a student at McGill University, I did have the opportunity to visit Russia, or at that time, the Soviet Union, on 2 occasions. My first visit took place in the summer of 1978, when I was enrolled in summer language courses, 3 weeks in Moscow, and then 3 weeks in what at that time was called Leningrad. I was utterly bewitched by Leningrad, not so much by Moscow, but Leningrad was just quite a revelation to me. Understand that I steeped myself in 19th century Russian literature, much of which unfolds. I mean, the plots unfold in St. Petersburg, and I was just amazed to see that at that time, at least, the city really in its center actually looked pretty much like I think it must have looked at in the 19th century, to the heroes and anti-heroes of Dostoevsky, Gogol, and other lesser writers. One thing I remember, especially about Leningrad at that time, was I could swear that there were more cats visible in the city than cars. That is no longer the case. And I don't know, Anna Arkadьевна, whether that was your experience of Leningrad at that time, but it certainly was mine that summer of 1978. I returned to Russia to the Soviet Union during my senior year, and even made a trip back to Leningrad while I was working at JEVS in the spring of 1980. Okay, so moving on. Well, I decided after spending a while at that social work job, pretty underpaid, Actually, I moonlighted to some extent as a freelance translator, mostly of diplomas and official documents from Russian into English. But I decided to enter graduate school in the Slavic Languages and Literatures program at the University of Michigan. For most of the time, I supported myself through graduate school as a teacher of Russian. I taught Russian in the Slavic department from the get-go, of course, under the supervision of regular faculty. I was also able to find employment on the strength of my Russian skills with some fairly prominent scholars as a research associate. One of them you see at the top of the screen, Zvi Gittelman, a political scientist. He hired me to listen to interviews of Soviet immigrants to the United States, rather extensive interviews, lasting a half hour or longer, and then summarize them in English. Of course, the interviews proceeded in Russian. With the historian William Rosenberg, a co-author of the book you see at the bottom of the screen, The Strikes and Revolution in Russia in 1917. I helped with a lot of the research that went into this book. It was a really tedious job. I was basically going through microfilms of Russian language newspapers put out in 1917, 1918, looking for particular bits of interest to his research project. And then while in graduate school, I had the opportunity to return to Russia, or I'm sorry, the Soviet Union, once again, this time for a much longer stay. Basically, I spent an academic year in Moscow with some, weekend visits to other parts of the Soviet Union. And I was a student at the so-called Pushkin Institute of Russian Language, which you see on the left of your screen. It's still, I believe, in the same place. Moskva, Ulica Volgina, Dom 6. The Pushkin Institute at that time, I don't know if it still retains this profile, but at that time it was basically a teacher training college. And for the most part, the student body was an international one, composed, in fact, of non-Soviet citizens. In theory, everybody who was studying there was a teacher of Russian language in the making, or in some cases already in service. So there was a very international profile to this. Russian was ordinarily the lingua franca for all these different groups. Americans, there might have been 50 or so there. Lots of Poles, 300 Poles, 296 women, 4 men. A lot of Vietnamese students. They were kind of the second largest contingent. And then from all other parts of the world, we were mixed in with different nationalities. I studied in groups where alongside other American students, as well as students from New Zealand, France, Germany, and even Tunisia. Now, mind you, this was in 1983 and 84. Personal computers, well, I think the whole idea of personal computers was maybe something that only 10 people in the world knew about. Typewriters were a kind of a restricted item in Russia. Thus, what you see on the right side of the page, as a participant in this academic year program, I had to write a rather lengthy research paper 30 pages. And I happened to find it in time for this presentation. You'll note that it's not typed, it's not word processed, it's written all on hand. So imagine 30 pages, all handwritten. I'm not sure that today's young students, as much as I respect them, would be up to such a task. But we, the brave, the few, the retrograde, we're doing such things. Now, of course, I was doing more than simply studying during that year in the Soviet Union. At that time, I would say American students, or let me put it this way. Okay, let's go that way. American students, insofar as they insofar as they rubbed shoulders, let's say, with Soviet citizens, did so with citizens from one of three different groups. The first would be black marketeers, Soviet citizens who were in the business of purchasing goods, Western goods, which were in extreme deficit, practically non-existent in the Soviet Union, or changing money, rubles into hard currency. A second group would have been informants. And then a third group of people foolish or brave enough and with an interest in Western culture, foolish or brave enough to actually decide to associate with foreigners, including Americans. Now, informants sometimes belong to the first camp and the other camp, but the people that I mostly hung out with were from that third camp. That is, people that were not afraid to associate with foreigners, or not sufficiently afraid. Although I'm pretty sure there were informants among them as well. You see on the screen some of the people that I met, some that I spent more time with than others. I kind of fell in with a group of nonconformist artists in Moscow. This is a picture of their community out in the woods. I'm not sure, but I think this might even be me, the guy that's not facing the camera. I found this in Google, but and then on the right side of the screen, you see Tatiana Loskutova and Inna Barlamova, two people that I spent a lot of time with. In the bottom corner is Lyubov Belozerskaya, the second wife of Mikhail Bulgakov. I actually was entrusted with a mission to deliver an honorarium to her, or I forget the word, what the word is, for a work that she had published in the West with artist publishers who specialize in Russian literature. And they gave me some money to take to her. We spent a lot of the time trying to find a way to spend that money in hard currency stores. The other two I saw less of, but I was kind of in the same circles with them, spent at least 1 or 2 nights at their apartments. The poet and conceptual artist Dmitry Prigov and Vladimir Sorokin, who has subsequently sort of made himself as one of the most wide-read Russian authors of today. Okay, so skipping ahead a bit, I left Ann Arbor in 1987, then embarked on a full-time career as a teacher of Russian and Russian culture, which over the next 30 or so years sort of became more and more an administrator of programs that involved Russian language to some extent. My first stop was at Grinnell College, where I taught from 1987 to 1993. And then, kind of on a lark, I moved to Hungary for what I thought would be a year and ended up being 11 years. The building that you see where my cursor is, if you're seeing my cursor, it's in the upper right-hand corner. This is where I taught for 11 years. It's called the Daniel Bergeny Teacher Training College, located in the city of Szombathely, Hungary, very close to the Austrian border. This city was actually a closed city so far as Americans are concerned. Until Hungary sort of wrested free of Soviet influence and became one of the post-communist states. This building actually belonged to the Hungarian equivalent of the Soviet Communist Party prior to that, but it was deeded over to the school during the change of regime. Actually, it has an even darker history because it was the site of Gestapo headquarters in wartime Hungary in World War II, and was bombed in an Allied raid. Thus, that's the newer looking building you see there. Then immediately below that, you see what had become St. Petersburg State University, where I'll talk a little bit about that soon. And then finally, here we have Indiana University with its famous sample gates entry there in the lower left-hand corner. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about my time in Hungary. Szombathely itself is a very old city. It goes back to ancient Roman times, and actually has three different names. When it was founded, it was called Savaria, a Latin name, and then it became Steinmanger, a German name, and then the Hungarian name Szombathely. It has two famous people who can claim it as a home, one of them fictitious. The first not fictitious is Saint Martin, who brought Christianity to the Gauls. The second is Rudolf Virag, who, if you've read James Joyce's Ulysses, is said to be the father of one of the main characters there, Leopold Bloom. And in fact, people in Szombathely celebrate that fact in various different ways. Now, what was I doing at this teacher training college? For the most part, I was teaching English, some linguistics, and some teaching methodology. It's a teacher training college. I was based in the English department, so I was teaching ostensibly those who plan to go on and become teachers of English. Oddly enough, many of my students were studying there only on the weekends because they had full-time jobs as teachers, but were suddenly compelled to retrain. Why? Because they had originally trained as teachers of Russian language, and all of a sudden, in 1989, there was less and less and less need for Russian teachers. So they had to really scramble and learn enough English, French, or German to be able to retain their position as a language teacher, while Russian language was being phased out rather quickly in Hungarian public education. So I worked with a lot of them. I should also mention that it was fortunate for me that the teacher training college also has a Slavic department with programs in Russian, Croatian, and Slovenian. And I befriended faculty there, so I had an opportunity to still, keep my hand in Russian, to speak Russian quite frequently. I also was able to establish some ties with the Russian Cultural Center in Budapest. I participated in some of their activities, took part in some of their conferences. And it is in Hungary that I met the second of the most influential and effective and compelling teachers, compelling in all kinds of ways. The one and only Veronika Trotter, to whom it has been my enormous good fortune to share a life together for more than 20 years now. Veronika and I met in 2002. Although we met in Hungary, it should be said that Veronika herself is a native of Pushkin, Russia, Tsarsky Selo, but at that time was working as a Hungarian teacher in St. Petersburg and doing research on a project of literary scholarship, and we met very fortuitously, and we're quickly married within months. So, Veronika, if you're still out there, and what else? What you see here down at the bottom of the screen is actually where Veronika and I lived for our last 2 years in Hungary. When Veronika and I got married, we moved to Budapest. We lived in the oldest part of Budapest, a region called Óbuda, which literally means Old Buda. Like Szombathely, it dates back to Roman times, and these are ruins, Roman ruins that were like within five minutes walking distance of our apartment. I also had the opportunity to visit Russia on a few occasions while I was living in Hungary. To deliver presentations, lectures on various topics, but mostly teaching methodology. And in one case, visiting Karelia to talk about Hungarian culture and the linguistic affinities of the Karelians, the Finns, and other Finno-Ugric peoples, getting as far as Kalevala, which is way up here, very, very, very far north. Took forever to get there, like 2 days or so. Okay, so what happened next? Well, Veronika and I decided to take advantage of a job offer that had been made to me, and moved to St. Petersburg. For Veronika, it was actually a return home. In St. Petersburg, I was hired by the American Councils for Education to be the resident director of the newly launched Russian flagship program. Now, I think many of you here know about flagship. You know that there are now flagship programs in a number of different languages. But at this time, there was, I think, only really one. And in fact, the flagship program itself didn't have much of a foothold in American universities. But it did have a presence at St. Petersburg University. The initial cohorts of flagship students were chosen mostly from those who had recently graduated with bachelor's degrees from a variety of different institutions. There was no feeder institution as such. That's different now, I think, with flagship. And they came to St. Petersburg in very small groups, 10 or less, to spend a year of intensive study of Russian language and culture. in hopes of bringing their proficiency up to the professional level and securing positions, ideally, according to the funders, in the U.S. government. So that is where I spent the next 3 years. It's interesting. I think that time in Russia gave me a much, shall I say, broader view of Russian culture. I mean Russian kind of everyday culture with a small c, not a big C, in terms of everyday life and certain aspects of Russia that I've been very much unfamiliar with. We were residing there when our oldest daughter was, we moved there when she was 1. We left when she was 4. So I got to see a lot of, what preschool education was like, and kind of the bureaucracy of that and the whole culture of that as well. It also gave me, sort of a frontline view of the Russian higher education system. A lot of my job was really not so much interpreting language between two languages as interpreting between two educational cultures. The American educational culture from which the flagship students had emerged, and then the Russian educational culture of their teachers at the university. But all in all, it was a great experience. Sometimes a little stressful, but we spent a very interesting 3 years there in St. Petersburg. But then we moved to Bloomington, Indiana, where, as Olga mentioned, I've been working at the Russian East European Institute. Now, my connection, though, with Indiana University actually predated our move here. Because while living abroad, first in Hungary and then the Soviet Union, I would return every summer to teach in what at that time was called the summer workshop in Slavic, East European, and Central Asian languages, abbreviated SWSEEL, SWESL. And at that time really devoted just to those languages. Of course, under Kathleen's direction, the program has expanded to all kinds of languages outside of Eastern Europe and Central Asia. But at that time, there was a core set of quite a few languages, lots more Central Asian languages than now, and of course, a full-scale Russian program. You see here on the left of the screen, my colleagues in the summer language program. On the left, Larry Richter. Next to Larry, Anna Arkadievna Sharagorodskaya, who has honored me with her presence here today. And the workshop gave me the opportunity to make the acquaintance and become friends with Anna Arkadievna, from whom I also learned quite a bit about Russian language, Russian culture, Russian society, and who has been an enormous help to me in other ways, not only when I was the resident director of the flagship program, but even here at the Russian and East European Institute. Next to Anna Arkadievna is her good friend, Dodona Kiziria, Professor Emerita of Slavic languages and literatures, who, at least when I was teaching at SWESL, was teaching Georgian. And then at the very end, bearded, with a characteristically amused expression on his face, Jerzy Kolodzy, a legendary director of the summer workshop from the mid-'80s until almost the end of the first decade of our current century. Jerzy I'm also deeply indebted to for sticking with me as an instructor year after year, and enabling me to take part in this wonderful program with wonderful teachers, students, colleagues. And he has also become a good friend of our family as well along the way. Finally, a little bit about the Russian and East European Institute, where I currently work. Sort of thanks in part to my experience as the director of the flagship program, and because of my familiarity with Indiana University through participation in the summer workshop as an instructor of Russian. I was offered the position of the associate directorship for the Russian and East European Institute at the beginning of the summer of 2007. And Veronica and Irina, our oldest daughter, we all made the move to Bloomington permanently. And we've been here since, to this very day. So Russian language, well, as a matter of fact, I do continue to use Russian quite a bit in my current position, although I've stopped teaching in the summer. My last summer was 2017. I continue to speak and write Russian almost every day. And some of the activities that I've been responsible for or that I initiated actually involve a very, very large Russian component. Of course, I don't want you to get the idea that all I do is Russian. We are very, very conscious, and more so, to let people know that we are more than just about Russia. We actually cover a vast region from Armenia and Georgia, the whole extent of Russia, on to Ukraine, the Baltics, Belarus, and as far as Hungary, Czech Republic, and the Balkan area. But talking about matters Russian, some of the special programs and events that I've had a hand in are depicted here. On the left, you see two American instructors of a high university college, a faculty of journalism, who took part in a so-called U.S.-Russia journalism faculty exchange. And again, Anna Arkadievna Sharogorodskaya played a very instrumental role in this project. Her organization in Russia, the Regional Press Institute, a very special organization which has campaigned and been active in all kinds of ways so as to promote democratic values, and especially the values of a free press and best practices for a free press. She became our partner in this program, and we had a wonderful exchange. Her institute selected 5 faculty members from provincial institutes, not from St. Petersburg, from provincial institutes in Northeast Russia, as far afield as Murmansk and Arkhangelsk, also Petrozavodsk and Novgorod. Each of them came to Bloomington for a 2-week sort of field trip where they attended journalism classes, met representatives of local media, and presented as well in our lecture series. And then from the American side, we selected a group of 5 faculty at institutions in the South to go over for a 2-week visit altogether to St. Petersburg, with very much a journalist orientation. And Anna Arkadievna and our staff arranged a wonderfully informative, engaging set of meetings, visits, and like meetings with representatives of major media outlets like Nova Gazeta, Fanpankaru, as well as to the journalism faculties of St. Petersburg State University and other major institutions like Novgorod State University. In the middle, you see another one of our attendees here today, the Alyona Dolyenko, now teaching Russian at Alyona. If I mess this up, please forgive me, but I believe it is University of Oklahoma. Or Oklahoma.
Yes, correct.
Okay, I got it right. Thank you. Okay, Alyona took part as a judge at the Indiana ACTR Olympiada of Russian language, an annual event that I am the chair for since 2009, where high school and middle high school students of Russian come from different schools to demonstrate their prowess in tackling the Russian language at various different levels. Another pre-college program that I've been involved in is the so-called Rasinka program. This is an after-school program for children who speak Russian as a heritage language. In other words, they're living in the United States, but being raised in Russian-speaking households. Unfortunately, it's no longer in existence, but we had a good run of about 10 years or so. And you see here a picture from our annual traditional Russian Yolka, Christmas, New Year's Eve party. There's Ded Moroz, standing next to Snegurочка, figures that are sort of mainstays of the Russian holiday season. Lastly, something that I'm particularly proud of is what we call the Russian language colloquium, originally known as Россия по-русски, lately rechristened as Прямая речь, straight talk, and these are lectures, presentations, talks that take place exclusively in Russian, and not in any kind of watered down or simplified Russian as you know, native speakers use it with educated speakers of the language, on really a vast array of topics. It's pretty much an open topic series, and I believe I counted the other day, I think we've had 80 talks or so now in this series. It started in 2011. Our first speaker was a noted Russian media personality, historian of rock and roll and ecological activist, Artemin Troitsky. Anna Arkadyevna has graced the program with talks on at least 2 occasions. And you see that it's still going strong. We've had 2 lectures so far in this semester, and we plan to have another 2 and to finish up with another 4 in the spring semester. So I'm going to end it there. I think I've spoken far too long, and I'll stop sharing my screen, and then I'll be very happy to take any questions, to field any objections, criticisms, constructive or otherwise. But I'll just close in saying thank you very much for coming today and for your attention. So I'm open to questions or whatever.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mark, for taking us on this exciting journey. And yes, we do have a couple of minutes for questions. So you're welcome to raise your hand and then unmute or put in the chat, whatever is easier. I think it's a small group enough for you just raise your hand and unmute and ask.
Yeah, and you, Olga, you may have to call on people because I'm still sort of figuring
Yes.
out how to see everybody. Oh, here we go.
Yes, Susan.
Just one addition, Mark. You very modestly didn't mention that you're one of maybe 2, 3, 4 recipients of a special service award of the American Council of Teachers of Russian in recognition for all that you've done in that arena too. So I just wanted to point that out too.
That is very kind of you to mention, Susan. I still think that word was kind of a fluke, but I was very delighted to accept it.
Absolutely not a fluke.
Well, thank you. Yeah, Susan is actually for many years my colleague as a member of the board of directors of the American Council of Teachers of Russian, which incidentally Olga I stepped down from earlier in the year. So I'm no longer, and I also stepped down from the national directorship of Olympiad at the end of this past spring, but I continue to be the Indiana representative. Well, it looks like I've stunned you into silence.
Lots to process, but I do have a couple of questions, if you don't mind.
Okay, please, Olga.
Yeah, I was wondering if you can give some advice to students of Russian, especially in current conditions, and also in students of Russian or other languages, who are thinking about what now is called alternative careers, not in teaching.
Yeah, those are really good questions. I'm very fond of talking about language learning. I'm sort of also a lifelong learner of learning languages, and I've tried all kinds of different ways to do it. I speak somewhat rusty, but more or less proficient Hungarian as well, which I learned in a very different way than I learned Russian. I'm going to speak about the situation of most students who are pursuing language study in American institutions, and for Russian, let's say, and maybe some other languages as well. Yes, it's yeah, the fact of the matter is that it's almost impossible to travel to Russia, nor do I think would many students want to, given the political situation. It's kind of ironic. Well, ironic's maybe not the word, but when I was a student, when I was an undergraduate, and even when I was a grad student, it was actually very hard to get into Russia, to get into the Soviet Union. The visa procedure was much more involved, and living in Russia was a challenge. Living in the Soviet Union was a challenge, certainly for those who live day to day, year to year in the Soviet Union. But for somebody coming from the West, involved grappling with some very unfamiliar things. The people that I showed you that I associated with, I could never have invited them to come and visit me in my dorm. I always had to, call them from a phone booth. That was actually a kind of thing that foreigners in Russia were always collecting these 2 kopeck pieces. So you would have enough to make a phone call from a phone booth. Nor was it really looked upon favorably if you visited Russian friends and brought along a Russian friend from another circle. That was very much a faux pas, because you never know, who is this person? Can they be trusted, and the like. There was a brief period all too brief. From say Perestroika until the Russian invasion, when at least for foreigners and those studying Russian, things were much freer. There was much more opportunity to study and whatnot. But again, somewhat ironically, and this is something I observed as a resident director, I think when I was first going to the Soviet Union, there was far more interest in engaging with Americans on the part of Russian speakers than there was, say, in the 90s and the teens. Simply because in some sense we were sort of forbidden fruit, if I can call it an expression, and it was just very unusual to run into people. So getting back to your question, I'm sorry, Olga, for going like that. What is my advice? One, I would say, although it's hard to go to Russia and whatnot, read as much as possible. But try to approach your choice of readings in a kind of intelligent way. One thing that I actually found very, very helpful in learning Hungarian was actually to reread in Hungarian translation novels that I had read before in English, like John Updike or Kurt Vonnegut. I read them in Hungarian, and it's good because you already know the plot, some of the characters, so you get a kind of flow in your reading that you might not get were you to pick up some classic work of literature in that language. Not to say that there's anything bad about that. You should read those kinds of things too, but as purely an aid to language learning, reading those kinds of things, that you're already familiar with is very helpful. By the same token, I advise people, if you're somebody that keeps up with the news, keeps up with current events, either internationally or nationally, to you've ingested the day's news in English or your native language. And then seek out, how is this news item being treated in the Russian language? Okay, you already have a kind of scaffolding in terms of content, and then so you can devote more mental energy to processing the new vocabulary structures and the like. The second thing I would say is, as much as possible, seek out opportunities to use and hear Russian. I don't think students do enough of this, when they have the opportunity to do so. This is what's great about summer programs like the language workshop, because they're plenty of people to engage with, and they're very interested in engaging with the students. Excuse me. And then thirdly, and this is something that was very difficult, not very difficult, but difficult at times for students in the flagship program, where the goal was to get to a really high level of proficiency. And these are students who come in having been taught through the communication methodology, which encourages a lot of speaking and to some extent discourages correction or favors correction in very sort of indirect ways. So the students were coming in and they thought, oh, wow, my teachers think I'm really proficient and I speak really well and everything. And all of a sudden, they have teachers who are pointing out mistake after mistake after mistake. But this is the thing. You can decide to sort of learn language at one level to be a permanent kind of advanced mid speaker for the rest of your life. But if you want to move into the superior area, you have to do more and more polishing of your language. So I would try to encourage students to be, you should really be grateful that teachers, and not just teachers, I mean, the people that they were living with, because they were all on homestays, you should be grateful that people will point this out to you. Ordinarily, and I think this works in many other languages as well, ordinarily, people do not engage in a lot of correction of somebody speaking a language foreignly, if you're the native speaker, if that person is speaking at a fairly elementary level. But the higher the proficiency, the more expectation there is that you will get the structures right. You will get the vocabulary right. So my advice in that sense is to embrace the opportunity to be corrected and to capitalize it, you know, to go, oh, okay, that's something that I'm doing all the time. I got to work on that. You know, I will be conscious about working on that, trying to use that structure, listen for it, and like, okay, those are some ideas. Was there another question? I'm sorry.
There was another question about, you know, tips for those who are thinking about careers outside of, you know,
careers.
teaching.
Yeah. Well, there always seems to be some possibilities to do sort of social work with native Russian speakers and later native Ukrainian speakers, and not maybe to the extent that was the case when I was involved in such activity. But in certain parts of the country, yeah, there are opportunities. Actually, I know of one student who found work. She's actually was a major in Russian here at Indiana University, and she didn't find a job as a social worker. She found a job as an insurance agent. They hired her specifically to sell insurance to Russian speakers in the Indianapolis area, of all places. So that's one area. Of course, the government service is another. Even business. Alyona, you and I, and maybe you too, Anna Arkadievna, may remember Tyler Madsen, who I believe is still working for a major producer of foodstuff with markets in Central Asia, and most of his work he does in Russia. You know, Russian is still, for better or for worse, you know, a major lingua franca. You know, the major lingua franca, I think, in Central Asia, not so much Eastern Europe anymore. So those are just some ideas. I mean, frankly, you know, I think I've been very fortunate in being able to make something of a career using Russian. I think even beyond the career aspect of it, I would simply say that, you know, knowing a foreign language and knowing it well just is incredibly enriching, you know, just for the soul. I mean, you know, you might not make any money, but it just really expands your appreciation of life and other people. So just as a means of personal development, I think that in that alone, there's a lot of good in learning language. Of course, it's hard. You know, not everybody wants to undertake such a challenge, but I do believe it's worth it.
Of course, yeah. Well, I think that's a good, a lot of advice and helpful advice and good, you know, concluding thought. Very wise. So we would like to thank you for your time and your generosity. It was very fascinating and enriching. And thank you for sharing this with us. And yeah, have a good evening, and we'll see you around, I guess.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm clapping because that's what you do in
Yes.
rugby. You know,
Yes.
even if you're the one being clapped at, you clap back. Right. Thanks. It's so good to be with you all today. Hey, you know, have fun learning Russian or whatever language you choose.
All right. Thank you.
Bye-bye.